Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest today is Payam Banazadeh. He's the CEO and founder of Capella Space. The website is CAPELLA space.com. Payam, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself? Happy Wednesday to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to get you on. I know that you guys are doing great things with, I guess they're called Synthetic Aperture Radar small satellites. So you can describe it a lot better than I can. Can you tell me the premise of Capella Space and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, sure. We started the company a few years ago after being pretty frustrated with, if you remember, there was a Malaysian flight that went missing. It was a flight that took off from Malaysia. It was going to China, MH370, hundreds of passengers, 777, and it just went missing. And I remember watching CNN pretty frustrated at the fact that we couldn't find this massive plane, and multiple governments were looking for it. So that was a frustration point for us. We started looking into why is it that we're not able to find that big plane, and why is it that we're not monitoring our planet frequent enough to see big things missing like that. And when we found that majority of our planet is cloudy, believe it or not, and half of our planet is nighttime, and that poses this huge limitation for all of these other satellites that are out there that are using optical imaging. Optical imaging is not able to see through clouds and is not able to see at nighttime, and that is about 75% of any given time or any portion of Earth that's either covered with clouds or nighttime. And so there is another technology called Synthetic Aperture Radar, which does penetrate through clouds, so you could do imaging even when it's cloudy, and it does do imaging properly at nighttime, so we can also image at nighttime. And the technology has been around for a very long time. However, the satellites that do synthetic aperture radar imaging are the size of a school bus. They're built by governments, 1,000 kilograms, billion-dollar satellites, and so we started a company to change that. And our satellites, we essentially took that 1,000-kilogram satellite and we miniaturized it, and now we've got a 37-kilogram satellite size of a backpack that can image through the clouds at nighttime, and we're launching them in dozens to be able to monitor our planet all the time.
Oh, that's really cool. An idea that came to mind is, so you said they'll be able to see at night and also through clouds. What about if there's storms? Can they see into a storm? We might be able to get images of the inside of tornadoes or the inside of hurricanes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is the technique that's being used to do this type of imaging. It's an active imaging system, and we're sending out signals from our satellites. Specifically, we're sending signals in X-band in the 9 to 10 gigahertz frequency. And in that band and that frequency, clouds are completely transparent. So the signals, go through clouds. If you've got a tornado, for example, or a hurricane, they also don't see any of that stuff. It just goes through it. Furthermore, if it's foggy, we don't really care. If it's hazy, we don't care. If it's pollution, we also don't care. So as a lot of places in China, for example, it has pollution problems, which also doesn't really help with doing optical imaging. You're just going to see the pollution from space. We can see through all of that, and so it's a pretty powerful technique to do very reliable and frequent imaging from space.
Can you talk a little bit about the science of how synthetic aperture radar works and why it can see through these through night and through clouds when other radar can't?
Yeah, well, so it's as if you're carrying your own flashlight. If you think about optical imaging, the way optical imaging works, and by the way, your phones are using optical sensors, right? It's waiting for the light to get to it. So it's just sitting there. It's not really sending anything out, and it's just waiting there passively waiting for the light to get into the lens to then be able to form an image. Well, as you have experienced, I'm sure, if you take your phone into a dark room, there is no light. And if there's no light, there's no picture. And same thing holds in space. All of these satellites that are using optical imaging, it works just like your phone. They just have a bigger lens in their satellite, and they're waiting for the light to get to it. And if it's nighttime, there's no light getting into it. And if it's cloudy, the light that's getting into those lenses are coming from the top of the clouds and obviously not from under the clouds. Radar, however, synthetic aperture radar, you are actively sending out energy and signals from your sensor out. And so it's as if you're carrying your own flashlight, and so you don't really care about the light being out there or not because you're providing the light. And the power that you're sending out, as I mentioned, in that X-band frequency, clouds are transparent, so it penetrates through the clouds. And what happens is these signals travel through space. Our satellites are flying at 500 kilometers, and they travel 500 kilometers, they go through the clouds, they come all the way down to the ground. Let's say we're imaging San Francisco, and then they reflect back from San Francisco, they travel another 500 kilometers up, they penetrate the clouds again, they come back to our sensors, and then we make sense of those signals, and we can form an image of what it is that we're looking at, and how does it look, and what are the characteristics, what are the materials, what's the moisture, and all of these hidden information that's already in that signal that we received back. And so those are the main differences on how it's done compared to optical.
Well, quick question here: are your satellites going to be in geostationary orbits, or are they low Earth orbits, so that they're passing over the whole surface of the Earth? Does that signal bounce down at a diagonal and then bounce up at another diagonal?
Yeah, so no, we're not in geo orbit. So geo is in the 40,000 kilometer, and it's where usually all the communication satellites are. The unique thing about geo is if you put a satellite up at 40,000 kilometers, the rotation of that satellite around Earth and the rotation of Earth around itself syncs up. So you will always hover around one area all the time. The problem, however, specifically for doing synthetic aperture radar is because you're so far away from space, it takes a lot of power and a lot of energy to be able to generate, send those signals that are sufficiently powerful to travel that many thousands of kilometers and then bounce back up. So all of these satellites, including ours, are in the low Earth orbit, which is the 500 kilometer range, which doesn't really hover over one area. It actually goes around Earth. So our orbits, one satellite goes around Earth in about 90 minutes. And so you're not hovering around one area, you can cover a much wider area and go around our planet.
But that's what's amazing to me is because you're essentially sending out a signal in one spot, and then the signal is bouncing back to you. You said, 500 kilometers away? So you're going through two different, I guess, yeah, it's the same signal, but it's bouncing through two different types of cloud cover or two different types of atmosphere, but you're still able to reconstruct it pretty accurately, right?
Well, yes, and all of this. I mean, the way I describe it sounds like it's going to take a long time for the signal to travel, through 500 kilometers and then bounce back up and come back another 500 kilometers. But we're going at speed of light, so that's 300,000 kilometers per second, and so all of this happens in a fraction of a second, right? The signal is generated, it goes all the way down to the ground, 500 kilometers, and then it bounces back up in a tiny little fraction of a second. And so, in fact, when all of this happens, when you have sent and received the signal back, your satellite hasn't moved that much. This is how fast the signal is traveling, right? And it's a little crazy to think about it that way, but in reality, that's how it's going to work out.
Yeah, I'm impressed not only with the speed, but the fact that you're going through two different parts of the atmosphere as it goes down and comes back up, and that's not enough to interfere with the image you're able to create. That's what I think is doubly impressive about it. That's why I was surprised.
Yeah. Well, it's in the frequency that we use X-band that, all of those atmospheric conditions are essentially just not there. The signals just don't see it.
Okay. It's probably a silly question, but what can you see that satellites can't see right now? You can see through rain, you can see through clouds. So, is the resolution of the image, is it even better than current satellites, or is it just as good? What can we see with it?
Yeah, so besides from the ability to see through clouds and at nighttime, which allows you to now have reliability and have, persistency and frequency, right? So you can always promise people that you're going to be able to look at a location every hour of every day and every night, no matter what the conditions are. And that's a big deal. Besides from that, because this imaging technique is an active imaging technique, right? You're sending signals from your satellite, which you understand really, really well because it's coming out of your system. And then you get the return and you can compare the two. It's a coherent system. You also get additional measurements that you might not be able to get. You definitely don't get with optical. I'll give you an example. When we do a collection over, let's say, San Francisco at hour, 9 in the morning, and we come back with a second satellite and do another collection later in the day, maybe 6 p.m., and we put those two images on top of each other, we can understand how the surface of San Francisco, how the surface of Earth or the ground or, buildings or everything that we've looked at, how in the Z dimension, if there's been any changes to millimeter accuracy, right? So people have been using this to detect tunnels because as you're digging tunnels underground, the surface of Earth is getting, it goes down by only maybe a millimeter or 2 millimeters, and that's visible. You can use synthetic aperture radar to detect that. You can see, tracks of tires on muddy roads, for example, because it does displace the ground by a little bit. When oil and gas companies are pumping gas or air into the ground to pump out oil, the surface is also changing by a few millimeters, so you can clearly see that. There's a Millennial Tower in San Francisco that you might be aware that's actually tilting by a couple millimeters. It wasn't constructed properly. You can detect that from space. We're talking about a millimeter here and there. So it's a pretty powerful coherent technique to look at very, very little changes on the ground. And that's something that you really can't get with optical imaging. The other thing is because, again, this is computational data, you're getting the signals back and you really understand what you send out. You get a lot of understanding of the characteristics of the surface that you're looking at. So reflectivity, texture, moisture, those are things that are also hidden in that signal, and you can extract that type of information out of it, which could be very helpful and useful in a lot of different applications.
Yeah, that's amazing. Huh. I guess you calibrated on the Leaning Tower of Pisa as it leans every year.
Yeah, right.
So what are some of the specific applications that governments or companies are crying out for? What do they most want to solve or see or observe?
Yeah. So we are, what we're really interested and excited about is, space is becoming open for business. It's been, there used to be that space is, a place where governments can throw these billion-dollar satellites, and as a commercial company, no matter how big you are, it's just too expensive and it just doesn't make sense for you. And the excitement that we have is, that's changing now. And so we want to make space a place where, you can run operations. We want to provide information from space to commercial companies and help them in their operations and become very tactical in what they do. And I'll give you a specific example. We're working with a utilities company out in a European country, and these guys have a lot of infrastructure. Some of them are underground pipelines of all sorts, gas pipelines and whatnot, and they spend a lot of money every year to fix the damages that are done to their pipelines. Whether it's a random construction company that digs a hole and then all of a sudden they damage their pipeline, or someone builds some other infrastructure on top of their pipes they're losing a lot of money and a lot of their resources on stuff like that. And the problem is out on the ground, obviously the land is too big for them to be able to cover all of it at the same time in real time. So they send out crew here and there, and the crew, manually inspects the infrastructure and makes sure that it's not damaged and make sure that no one is really touching anything. So what we can do from space, we can essentially start monitoring all of their pipelines everywhere. And we could, once we get to a point where we can do this on an hourly basis or at very high frequency, then as things are developing, maybe there's a bulldozer moving in and it's about to do construction, or maybe there's some movement somewhere and it's getting a little too close to a very expensive and exquisite infrastructure, then we can notify these companies and they can send a crew to either prevent something from happening or fix it immediately so it's not causing more trouble. And so that's one use case, just monitoring important places around the world for people and notifying them for whatever it is that they care about. And we see a lot of commercial applications for that. Obviously for government, on the civil side, as there is a natural disaster developing somewhere, whether there's a hurricane or flooding or fire, it's really, really important to be able to have sort of eyes in the sky while this is developing. And unfortunately, majority of natural disaster happens, when the weather is not that great. If it's flooding, it's certainly raining. And so you can't really fly things. It's a no-fly zone. You can't have optical imaging, but it's really important for you to understand how the flooding is getting developed to then be able to route the emergency, the first responders, and be able to figure out where the damage is being done. Insurance companies are interested in the same information to understand, damage assessment of which one of the properties were damaged more, to send for help and understand, risk assessments and things of that nature. So there's a wide variety of different applications in the commercial sector that we're interested, as well as in the government sector that we're really interested.
So this is like a pay to view, specific areas type thing. What percentage of the Earth could you observe if you wanted to just continually observe it? And is there a path or a desire, I'm sure there is, to be able to see the entire Earth to millimeter accuracy everywhere, to cover it 100% and observe the whole thing?
Yeah, so we, think about, and this might not sound that great, but there are a lot of places around Earth that's just really not that interesting and not valuable. I mean, middle of some random desert doesn't really deserve to be looked at every hour because there's just not stuff changing enough and often there. And so what we plan to do is we plan to monitor, the top 500 cities in terms of population, all the busy ports, all the shipping lanes, all the infrastructures around the world that people really care about, and be able to monitor them all the time and build a really nice archive of how those places have been changing on an hourly basis over time. And then there are places that, sometimes some companies or some governments have an interest to look, and it's not among that list. We can certainly look at those places as well. And so our strategy isn't to cover the entire globe, 100% of the globe, because that's just not a very efficient way of using our resources up in space, but it's more of a targeted approach of looking at important places where 90% of the changes are happening and people are interested in.
That makes sense. Okay. What about your satellites cross over other countries, and even in our country, they may see things that our government or other governments say, don't look at that. We don't want you looking there. How do you resolve that? Or do you need to cooperate with other governments, or are they going to be suspicious or wanting to talk to you or wanting to tell you what to do and what you can see, what you can't?
Yeah, so as an American company, obviously we have to follow the rules and regulations of U.S. and, there are certain restrictions that are put on companies like Capella for national security reasons. But, one thing about Capella is that we want to bring transparency into the world. And so, unless we're specifically asked we are under regulations as an American company to follow the rules of U.S. and for national security reasons, there are certain things we can't do. But in terms of at an international level, there's nowhere that we can't look, and there's no country that can come back to us and say you can't look at this place. And so we are excited to be able to provide transparency, to essentially everyone in the world, and I think that's an important thing that we want to be able to do.
Yeah, that's great. Earlier on, you said the government launched SARs are about 1,000 kilos, and they're huge, and yours are 37 kilos, size of a backpack. You said, I guess you're also launching constellations of them, so not just one, but a dozen or maybe dozens. Any other comparisons? The cost, the average cost of the government to launch one of their big ones versus the cost for you to launch, per satellite, your small ones, or the cost of your imaging versus theirs. Any metrics you can give that will be really cool to hear about?
Yeah, sure. So, these typical traditional satellites that do synthetic aperture radar and they've been doing it for a long time, 1,000 kilogram size of a school bus. In comparison, we're 37 kilogram and we're size of a backpack. On the cost side, it's, the traditional satellites are $1 billion or more. And so really, really expensive. And in comparison, our satellite is in the lower single digit million. So $1 billion to a lower single digit million, 1,000 kilograms to 37 kilograms, and then, size of a school bus to size of a backpack. And so quite a difference, I would say.
What about in terms of resolution? You're going to be doing millimeter or several millimeter resolution. What's in store for the next few years? Is it just getting these things deployed and then fine-tuning them, or is the technology also advancing where we're going to be able to get a lot more accurate? And would that even be helpful to get to sub-millimeter resolution?
Yeah, so just one point of clarification, the sub-millimeter, the few millimeter resolution is only in the Z dimension. So that's, how the surface is changing. The resolution of pictures in terms of pixels, in the X and Y are typically in the 1 meter or slightly less or slightly more. And that's kind of where we are. These exquisite, 1,000 kilogram satellites, one thing they can do really, really well that, we won't really be able to do for a long time is they can do a really, really fine, high quality resolution. So they can do, quarter meter resolution or better in those X and Y dimensions where we are starting to do 1 meter and then we're going to move towards doing half a meter. But that's okay because it's an exponentially more difficult problem to go from 1 meter or half a meter to, quarter meter to 10 centimeter. And what we found is 80-90% of all the applications that we're interested in, that 1 meter to half a meter resolution is actually sufficient. And it's just not worth it for us to, all of a sudden have a 1,000 kilogram satellite just because we want to have a 25 centimeter. So it's just one of those 80-20 rules where you're spending 20% of effort and you get 80% of the bang for your buck. But we are going to continue evolving. One thing about us is we are using the latest and the best technology that's getting developed out in other industries and bringing those to aerospace, which is not very common. We're flying a GPU on our satellite, and that hasn't happened before. And if you look at the entire aerospace industry, it's extremely conservative, and things are usually outdated by 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, believe it or not, the rover, for example, that we launched to Mars, your iPhone has more computational power than that rover. And so with us, we're just trying to evolve with the technologies of other industries and bring all of those into aerospace and move really, really rapidly.
Right, it makes sense. Okay. And then in terms of, I had seen an article saying that you just closed a new round of funding. So, just an update for listeners on your funding path, how that's going.
Yeah, so we just closed our B round. So venture, you raise money in multiple rounds, angel, seed, A, B, C, D, and hopefully you don't go after D. And you're using those capital to grow the company and hit some of your technical as well as the business milestones. So we just closed our B round. It's our third or fourth round of fundraising. It's a $20 million round, and it allows us to launch more satellites, develop more of our technical capability, as well as on the business side, obviously develop the product and get into market. So we're pretty excited about that.
Well, that's great. I see really great things for you guys coming. Any last comments? Any big watershed moments that are coming in the next 6 months or year or 2 years? Any big goals that you guys are working towards?
Well, we've got our first launch of the first satellite coming up in mid-November. We've been working on this for the past 2.5 years to essentially go from that 1,000-kilogram satellite to the 37-kilogram. And finally, after 2.5 years, it's launching in November with SpaceX out of Vandenberg, California. And so that's probably one of the biggest moments in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months. And then we have multiple launches scheduled after that. But it's a historic moment for our company as well as for our country, because we are launching the first commercial American SAR satellite. SAR satellites haven't been, they're internationally they exist. Germans have some, Canadians have some, Italians have some, but U.S. hasn't had any. And so we're changing that hopefully this November. And so we're pretty excited about that.
That's great. That's awesome. All right. So for listeners, how can they keep tabs on, the race towards the launch in November, and how can they find out more information or, get in contact for collaboration or other questions?
Yeah. So we, LinkedIn, Twitter, Capella Space, if they search any of that, they can keep up. I'm also on Twitter at Payam, B-A-N, Payam Ban, and happy to get in touch and chat more about this.
That's great. Payam, thanks a lot for coming. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.